So in the past, NextGen Fertilizers has done several soil clinics, and we usually try to do them in February and March. And so that was something we wanted to try to reach a broader audience because we feel like we can provide a lot of value when it comes to reading a soil sample and really understanding what that piece of paper means and derive a fertility recommendation off of that. So that's what Sam Bauke and myself are going to try to do today. So hopefully you guys can take away something. So just starting off with soil sampling in general. There's a few key principles you want to make sure you're always doing whenever you're pulling a soil sample or if you're hiring somebody to do it for you. And one of those is consistency, both in depth. If you're pulling a 0 to 6 or a 0 to 8 inch core, make sure every time you're actually going to that 0 to 6 or 0 to 8 inch. Otherwise, it does change that the lab number on that soil sample because they're calculating parts per million off of the depth that you're saying, or that you're telling the lab that you're pulling. So I think that's super important. And then if you're doing banded applications, so maybe a large application of nitrogen in season through a wide drop or a coulter machine, or a strip till especially, we need to make sure we're not just pulling cores from just the row, especially if you're not going back into that row year after year. So if you're changing row direction, you want to make sure you're getting a good, consistent, accurate sample of both what's in the row and in between the rows. So a lot of times we'll alternate where that core is coming from if there's a lot of banded applications for that certain field. What else you got?
Yeah, you hit it home with the consistency. A big thing is making sure your probe is straight up and down instead of going at any 45-degree angles. A big one, too, is knowing what the farmer did last year, because you don't want to sample right next. I don't like sampling next to the row because a lot of guys around here, especially, they're going to band something. So if you hit a band, your levels are going to be elevated. So I like to stay more in between the rows. And two, a lot of guys will just shift over, like with 30-inch rows, they'll just shift over 15 inches. So they're going to be planting right there anyway, and that's where a lot of your root zone is going to be. So to me, it makes sense to sample there and stay away from those bands because you're going to get, more than likely, you get elevated levels.
You don't want to plan to, any type of soil amendment application and just go off of like a composite sample. So by composite, I mean one or two samples throughout the field. Maybe we just say north half and south half samples. And you don't want to do that because there's a lot of variability within that field. And that's where a zone would be better suited for, soil amendment applications or even a grid sample too. We'll dive a little bit deeper into grid versus zones versus composite, and how many zones, is the right number. So we'll get more into that later. But I think, that is super important to keep in mind is how are you going to use the results. And if you're wanting to run like a build program or you're going to apply manure, or maybe manure was applied, it does change how you want to pull samples on that field. If you're in a pretty low CC field and everything's going to be fertigated, a lot of times it doesn't make sense to do a grid sample in that scenario because you're not going to variable rate fertilizer through the pivot most likely. And if we're just looking at nitrogen and phosphorus, a lot of times that's where farmers can save money and not do grid samples, knowing that it's really not going to, that data is not going to impact a decision. So I think kind of the first thing that I wanted to touch on was different extraction methods. So there's several different ones out there. Um, I really don't care whether it's a Malik 3 or an Olson or a Bray. I think it's more important that the agronomist or the farmer that's looking at that soil sample just understands what those certain numbers mean. Malik 3 is always going to be higher because the lab's using a very strong acid to extract and come up with that number. So, not to say that one extraction method's always better than another. I think when pH, a lot of times the lab will run a different phosphorus extraction when pH is high, and in that scenario, there is kind of a preferred extraction, and that would be Olson. Okay, so if your pH is above, is it 6.9?
I think it's 7.
Then they'll run an Olson test, and that's going to be more representative of what the soil will actually have for available phosphorus in that higher pH field. So other than that, like micronutrients and when it comes to Malik versus DTPA extraction methods, it's more just you need to understand what number you're looking at and what that number means for that extraction. I never want guys to switch back and forth from Malik to Bray to DTPA extraction methods, because then you really lose that year-to-year change, and that's what you want to track. So again, that's just another thing, be consistent on. And if you have 10 years of data on your farm built up with a Malik 3 extraction, keep running Malik, because you have all those past years data on that extraction method. And in the same, maybe you've been using a DTPA extraction method. I think it makes the most sense just to stay consistent in that, and then you can really track what those year to year what changes might have happened.
At NextGen Fertilizers, we provide solutions. We've developed 5 new products this year, including a nematicide and fungicide. Our starter products mean fewer gallons and no phosphorus tie-up in the soil. Reach out today and make your planter pass the best. Lock in 0% financing until 2027 on all products right now. NextGen Fertilizers. Easy to apply, proven to perform.
Yeah, I agree. The thing is to keep it consistent. That way you can track year over year what's actually going on. You have more experience with the Malik 3 from all the grid sampling we used to do for the Next Level program, but I'm more comfortable with like the S3C from Midwest Labs. So they do the Bray 1, Bray 2, and then if the pH is high enough, the Olson. So the Bray 1's, like you said, a weak acid that's more plant available right now. And your P2 is a stronger acid, which is kind of like a reserve bank that could potentially come available later. So when we do recommendations, we usually base them off of the P1. So the Malik 3, the numbers are going to be a lot more elevated because it is a strong acid. And it seems like the industry is going a lot more towards the Malik 3. But it is, you run one test on everything, and it is cheaper. But the point here is to keep everything consistent. That way you know what's going on, what you can make recommendations comfortably on, and that way you can track progress year over year of where your levels are. That's the main.
Right. I know we follow Brian and Darren Hefty quite a bit, and always try to attend or watch their live streaming of their soil clinic, and they're actually big promoters of the Malik 3 extraction, and we didn't really understand why necessarily, but it was really about their micronutrients. And what they would do is they'd do some strip trials where they'd go out and apply 100 or even 200 pounds of a manganese sulfate, for example, and they noticed that that would show up higher in the Malic 3. So they like the Malic 3 extraction method because they felt like it was more representative, or there was more of a response of a heavy application of a micronutrient. After talking to some soil scientists at Midwest, though, at Midwest Labs, we learned that the danger of using that Malic 3 is that it's going to show a higher number and not necessarily plant available number. And so DTPA for micronutrients, especially here in arid climates, in the Midwest, kind of the high plains, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, a lot of times we do have lower micronutrient levels, and we don't we don't want to be running a Malic 3 just because it makes us feel better because it's a higher number. We really want to know, is this micronutrient a yield limiting factor? So again, you can do that with either Malic or DTPA extraction. You just got to understand the numbers and what they mean for each extraction method. So let's just start off with the soil sample. What's the first thing you look at, Sam?
One of the first things I'm going to look at is, well, there's 4, but the biggest one is going to be pH. And with our pH and where we're at, a lot of times it's going to be on the higher end. So we know we're going to be limited availability of phos, zinc, manganese, and iron. So, and we know that already. So we know we're going to get a return from banding those nutrients next to the seed. The second thing would be our CEC number, our cation exchange capacity. So that's going to tell us what our soil can hold or do, I guess you could say. A big thing with this is our nitrogen management. So, and this isn't something I came up with, but it's for our CEC, for our nitrogen holding capacity, we take that number times 10. So if around here, we can have anywhere from a CEC of 5, which is low, is like a sand, to could even get to the 20, around 20, which would be more of a clay. So just for round numbers, let's say it's 10. So at any given point, we know we can hold 100. So if we take a 10 CEC times 10, which would be 100, at any given time, we can hold 100 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. So from there, we can start back figuring of, okay, I know at the most, we don't want to have 100 pounds of nitrogen in the soil, especially early on. We don't really do a whole lot of fall applied nitrogen around here, but we know in the spring, we're really exposing ourselves if we go above 100. And even in the spring, I wouldn't do that either because leaching potential, all those things. So with that, we can start making our plan with how much is in the soil from our soil test, as well as our yield goal, and then we can start making a plan of when to apply that nitrogen and when it's going to be the most efficient for us. So that's number 2. The third one would be the organic matter. It varies a little bit around here, but that's going to tell us kind of the soil health a little bit aspect there, plus some nutrient cycling. So the higher the organic matter, the better your soil is. That's not really groundbreaking. And then another one would be our base saturation levels. So we look at this to see how balanced our soil is and if there's any sort of amendments that we need to make. Usually around here, we usually sit pretty good. We're usually not out of whack too much. And a lot of that goes back to our pH is still being in the 6s to low 7s. We have a lot of naturally occurring potassium around here too.
Yeah, no, I think most agronomists would agree. Those are the 4 first things they want to look at on a soil sample. And I know a lot of guys just immediately look at okay, what's my residual nitrogen? It's really important to understand the base saturation and the pH, and that your base saturation percentages make your pH. So really, you said pH is the first thing you're looking at. I would agree. That's just going to tell us how balanced our soil is, okay? And that's going to impact every decision, every fertility recommendation we make is going to be influenced by how balanced our soil is. So there's a few different things that, so you've got your four cations, okay? Calcium, hydrogen, calcium, magnesium, and then sodium as well. So actually 5. Okay, so the ratio of those 5 cations is what determines your pH. So sometimes, you mentioned we're dealing with pHs that are higher than ideal for crops like corn and wheat in our area. And that would be really anything above like a 6.9. We get into 7. That would be a higher pH. So it can be that our calcium base saturation is too high, and that's what's driving up our pH. And a lot of times that is the case in our area here in Northeast Colorado. But there's also some instances where excess magnesium in our base saturation where that's actually driving up pH. So you mentioned potassium, and potassium has a little impact on pH, but if your potassium's too high or above that 10%, a lot of times it's robbing, that parking spot for either calcium or magnesium to sit on that soil colloid. And so making sure all those are in balance is crucial in making a recommendation and understanding just nutrient efficiency. So potassium, if you have excess potassium or you get above that 10% base sat, it's going to greatly impact your nitrogen use efficiency because they're actually going to be competing against each other. So that's the reason we like to look at pH and our base saturations, is because that really tells us what type of soil we're looking at. I want to view, base saturations as and CC is parking spots. Okay, so you've got all these negatively charged nutrients in your base saturations, your cations. Okay, so that's what's parking on the CEC, okay, or your soil's ability to hold on to nutrients. And so there's clay particles, there's silt particles, and there's sand particles. So sand is the largest particle, but it has the fewest parking spots. Clay is the smallest sized particle, but it has a lot of parking spots. So it has a lot of its ability to hang on to our cations is greater than a silt or a sand particle. And silt's kind of in between sand and clay particles. So that's what makes up your CEC, is it's determining how many clay particles or how many nutrients it can hold on that actual soil colloid. Okay, so you mentioned earlier, a good rule of thumb is to take your CEC times 10 to determine about how many pounds of nitrogen you can hold at any one time. Okay, and that's important because if when you get into low CECs of 4 or 5 CEC soils, you're not going to want to have 100 pounds of nitrogen out at any given time, knowing that 50 to 60 pounds of that is at risk of leaching, and you paid money for that fertilizer. Let's actually make sure it gets into the plant instead of just leaching out of the soil or out of the root zone,
which we have seen happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant battle in the sand. Another good thing about lighter CEC soils is that they're easier to impact. Okay, so if you do have a base saturation that's out of the ratio we want, it's easier to impact that because we're dealing with fewer soil particles that we're actually trying to change. Okay, if higher CEC, so a 30 CEC, for example, is going to take a lot more pounds of calcium or of a lime source to change the pH, because we're having to impact a lot more soil particles.
At NextGen, we create real value for farmers. Powered by Nutric technology, our planter pass lineup means fewer gallons while maximizing phosphorus efficiency. Our seed treatments include fungicides, nematicides, and insecticides. Whether you're running in-furrow, planter box, or starter applications, NextGen has the products that perform. NextGen Fertilizers, easy to apply, proven to perform.
So basically, there's a trade-off with a lower CEC soil. If you have an issue, you can fix it a lot quicker, but you cannot hold water very well, nutrients very well. The biology is not as good. But if you have a higher CEC, the trade-off, it's basically opposite. You can hold a lot of water. You usually have better biological activity. You can hold a lot more nutrients, but if you have an issue, it's gonna take a lot longer to balance, because it's harder to flush what we do not want out of the soil. So it's just, I mean, there's a trade-off of both. That's, when you have something in the middle around that, if you can find, or if your ground has something around that 15, that's kind of a good sweet spot. Not too heavy, not too light, in my opinion.
Right. So let's talk about what are those ideal base saturation percentages for each of those cations. So let's start with potassium, because I think that's the first one that shows up on a base sat if you're reading a soil sample from left to right. So potassium's main function in the plant is going to be stock in corn and wheat. Is going to be stock and stem strength and integrity. It's really that glue in the plant that's going to hold that plant upright in a windstorm, prevent lodging if we have higher populations, and maybe some rootworm beetle feeding. A higher potassium base saturation is going to help that crop have better stock strength. So if I'm looking at a soil sample and my CEC is below 10, so a lighter soil, I'm going to want that base saturation of potassium to be anywhere between like 5 to 7%. Okay? We can actually have a little lower base saturation of potassium when we get into medium to heavier textured soils. So kind of want to be, minimum of 3% base saturation of potassium, but I'd prefer 4 or 5 in CEC soils of 15 plus. Okay, and that's really ensuring that we're going to have good stock strength in corn and good stem strength in wheat. That potassium is very important to not just look at the base saturation, but also the parts per million, because it's actually the highest nutrient uptake by almost all crops. And a lot of times we just focus on nitrogen, but potassium is actually it has a higher uptake from a pound per bushel as even nitrogen does. Now, we don't always have to go in and replace all that potassium, because that potassium isn't in the kernel that we're hauling off the field at the end of the year. It's in the stover or the residue. And so if you're not baling stocks, or you're leaving that residue out there to break down, then it's just kind of a continuous cycle. So a lot of times that's why we don't have to apply potassium, even though the plant's uptaking a lot of potassium. Another Another cation would be magnesium. Okay, so magnesium, we'd really like to be in that 12 to 18% base saturation range. Okay, magnesium, I mentioned potassium's kind of that glue in the plant. Well, magnesium's the glue in the soil. Okay, so if you have a range of 12 to 18, magnesium's going to help provide a little bit of a holding capacity to that soil. If my CCs are lower, I want to be, again, below 10. I want to be closer to that 18% base saturation of magnesium.
I was actually sampling some yesterday in the area, and I would go to probe, and sometimes when I'd pull it up, I'd pull around the soil probe an inch or two of dirt or soil, around the bottom of the soil probe, which would indicate it's probably a little heavy on the magnesium. The soils, you can tell it's tight and it's wanting to hang on to everything. So without even getting the results, I bet you we're above 20.
Right. And that's that's another good point. We talked about how to take a good quality soil sample at the very beginning. That soil, is sticking to the outside of the probe that you don't want to put in the bag because it's not an actual part of your core. So with that higher magnesium percent, a lot of times once we get up above 18, we're shorting something else. Okay, and that's when we look at the calcium base saturation. So ideal base saturation for calcium is going to be anywhere between 65 to 75. You can be up a little higher than that in some instances, but again, all these base saturation percentages add up to be 100, or they should. If they don't, it's a lab error, which we have caught before. But so the sum of all these base saturations should add up to be 100% of your soil. And as we're talking about cations, we really are talking about the balance of the soil and overall soil structure. Okay, this is what's going to impact how that soil can handle nutrients. And that's why it's, the first thing we're looking at. If you get base saturations of calcium above 80%, which we deal with a lot around here because it's higher calcitic soils, that's going to drive your pH up. And again, with magnesium, if you get above that 18%, it's going to be driving that pH up. So your pH is just a result of your cation ratios. So another cation that will show up is hydrogen. And really that hydrogen is tested, it's only going to show up on pHs, I think 6.5 or under. Otherwise it will be 0. So a lot of times we don't see much of a hydrogen reading on our soil samples, and that's just because it's calculating no hydrogen, because that all of those soil particle and all those parking spots are taken up by calcium and magnesium and potassium. So if you have high hydrogen base saturation, above 10 to 15%, a lot of times that's going to indicate a low pH, and a lot of times that's going to say, we need calcium, or maybe we need both calcium and magnesium because, and that's where we do apply lime in that scenario. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about today was sodium. So ideally, less than 1% sodium is ideal to maximize yield potential. I've worked on some heavier soils that have had a long history of manure, and that sodium is up in the anywhere from 4 to 6% base saturation. and that really tells me we're dealing with very saline soils. Okay, we've got ursodic soils. We've got a lot of sodium out there due to the continuous application of manure, and that is going to impact yield. I'd say anything above 2% is going to have a negative impact on yield. You can also, once you get above 6% base saturation of sodium, you can also start to have some soil toxicity issues with where it's so much salt there. Well, I shouldn't say salt, where there's so much sodium there that it's actually toxic to the plant, and you're actually going to stunt that plant because it's having to metabolize all that sodium.
Yeah, and I've seen the fields you're talking about, especially year one of working with those. It was pretty evident. It definitely had a challenge on that one.
So one of the things that we did to help decrease that sodium, and this is why I didn't want to confuse sodium with the salt, because Na that you'll see on a soil test isn't necessarily a salt yet, okay? But if we apply a sulfur product, we can actually convert that to be a salt, and then it's leachable. Sodium is not leachable. So if you have let's just say, for example, a 6% base saturation of sodium, the first thing you need to do to fix that is make sure you have good drainability in your field, okay? Because we're going to try to flush that sodium out. And when you apply sulfur, it becomes a salt, and then we can flush it out and eventually leach it out of the soil profile. If you don't have good drainage, though, then you can never really leach it out. So the drainage is the first thing to fix. These particular fields we're talking about are high in magnesium too. So that makes it a challenge, especially in some of the bottoms where that base saturation of magnesium is above 20%. In some cases, even above 25%, because then it's really hard to convert that to a salt and leach it out. We can convert it to a salt with sulfur applications, but it's still just sitting in the top foot or two of soil because we don't have well-drained soils. So I think we talked about all the cations and the ideal base saturation percentages we want for a well-balanced soil, which is going to impact all of our fertility recommendations and all your efficiencies with the main nutrients that we're applying, for corn, sugar beets, wheat, really all crops that are grown around here.
Everyone's pretty well heard of organic matter, but what is it? It's basically just decomposed residue, manure. How would you describe it? I mean, outside of decomposed residue that's been through biology processes has become part of the soil tilth and things like that.
Organic matter is a percent derived from broken down organic material. And I think it's important to distinguish between organic matter and organic material. So organic material is crop residue, right? That's stubble, that's stover, okay? That's the past crops that you can go out and physically see in the field. That will eventually, a very small portion of that eventually will break down and contribute to organic matter. Organic matter is mainly measuring, that broken down crop residue, but also some of the biology that's there. And that's how I think you mentioned mineralizing earlier. That's how we can determine that soil's ability to cycle nutrients or to mineralize nutrients. So, and then to break down organic matter, there's water soluble portion of that organic matter that a lot of us have probably heard now. that it's becoming more talked about, and that's WEOC, or water extractable organic carbon. Okay, so that's the percentage of your organic matter that's actually water soluble. And I think there's a lot of I mean, it's definitely up for debate, and there's really not a whole lot of years of research around WEOC. I honestly, where I kind of stand on WEOC is that it's a cool term used in marketing, I think, by some companies. But as far as correlation to yield, and especially out here where we don't have a lot of beans, all our WEOCs are high. We've sent in over 100 samples to test for what is that WEOC level, and they're all high, which makes sense because we have a lot of high residue crops and a lot of heavy rooting crops, whether it's corn or wheat. All your grass crops are going to have a lot bigger of a root system than beans. So they're going to contribute to that carbon. Once it's broken down, becomes organic matter, they're going to contribute to that water soluble portion of that organic matter. So a good rule of thumb, as far as mineralizing, or your soil's ability to mineralize nutrients, is to take your organic matter percentage. So let's just, for easy math, let's just say it's 2%. Okay, so for every percent, we're going to multiply that by, it's a range of about 20 to 25. I usually just play it conservative and say 20 if we're shooting for higher yields, or maybe if we're really trying to maximize return on fertilizer, then maybe I'll factor in that 25 pounds per percent of organic matter. So in our example of 2% organic matter soils, we'd be roughly mineralizing, or our soil biology is going to fix atmospheric nitrogen and nitrogen that's not available in the soil and convert that to a plant available form at about 20 to 25 pounds per percent. So if you have 2% organic matter soils, you can figure out about 50 pounds of nitrogen mineralizing. Okay, if you have 1%, about 25
I don't
pounds.
think there's a lot of guys that are utilizing that the best way they can, or building that into their budget. But it also depends on having a healthy soil. So back to the organic matter, building organic matter. In my opinion, I think the best way to do it is to utilize some sort of manure source, in my opinion. But it also is good to have one of the best ways to do it is have a healthy crop and leave those roots intact as best as you can, and let them be decomposed. I would say there's more organic matter being built below ground than above ground.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. And it's like, especially with corn, we look at how tall, corn plants can get, 10, 11, 12, even 13 feet some years, depending on weather. And, that corn plant is going to have very close to the same amount of biomass below ground as it does above ground. So that root system is massive underground. And when that decomposes, it does, and really that's true with all grass crops because they're the heavier rooting crops. And so if you've got a heavier rooting crop, obviously not potatoes or sugar beets that we're removing the root, but, grass crops that we're leaving that residue in the soil, that is the quickest way to build organic matter is by continuous grass crops. And then I would agree with manure. So a lot of times we'll see on a cool day, and you're starting to dig into a manure pile and you see that steam coming off of it, and that's because there's biology in that manure that's creating that heat. And so when we apply manure to our fields, we're getting, some additional biology in there. But you're also getting there's also higher carbon in that manure versus the carbon that you'd be getting from like a
And
humic
another
acid.
thing on the organic matter, it will take years of doing the right things for you to build it. It's going to be a very, if you do it right, it will be a very slow process to get it even 1%. I mean, let alone 2%. It's going to take some time, but it really doesn't take that long to deplete it. Really, I mean, with aggressive tillage, poor management, constantly removing above ground residue. Yeah, I mean that can really knock it off pretty quick. And some of these soils, it's really hard to build, especially here where we have sand, sugar sand. I mean, they're not going to get above. If you get to 1 or even 1.5, that's pretty good for some of these soils. As you move east where we get more rain, it's not uncommon to see 3 to 5%, and here 2% is pretty good, really, and that's kind of about where we are with our geography.
Yeah, and I think that organic matter is super important to look at on some of these biological products, that are claiming to fix atmospheric nitrogen. A lot of times, especially out east, when you get above, that 2.5, 3%, you're mineralizing 70 pounds of nitrogen potentially, depending on the weather and the moisture. There's a lot of different variables in the mineralization process that need to be there. It's not just soil temperature, but there also has to be some moisture, and there has to be air in the soil too. And a lot of times I see these companies, claiming, oh, we can supply 20 pounds of nitrogen or 25 pounds of nitrogen or whatever it is. And I think some of them are relying on the organic matter to really carry the weight of the reduction to help their product look successful versus, truly improving nitrogen use efficiency from a synthetic source. So if you're not taking into account your organic matter percentage and counting on some of that mineralization into your fertility program, you're probably overspending, at some level. So I've seen guys in eastern Nebraska say they've got an NUE of 0.5, which it sounds great, but they're able to apply less synthetic nitrogen. It's not that their corn just doesn't need, that nitrogen to produce a bushel. It's just that it's getting it from the soil. So that's a really important thing to look at, and to factor in on your overall fertility program.
I would agree, which that's another topic for another day, but it's not, like you said, the 0.5 NUE of applied nitrogen. It's not that the plant was using less nitrogen, it's getting it from another source. And a lot of that comes from the soil. And someone said the other day, you heard it too, especially with this soil science, we're still in pretty much the infant stages of getting all this figured out. So there's a lot to be learned from our soil tests, and these basic numbers can help us guide us of what we can do. So we have to understand what our soil is giving us, and innovation is happening all the time. And that's with these soil samples and these results and things we're looking at, we're getting more efficient by the month. It seems like now. So if we can figure out how to use what our soil is giving us, it's going to give us a huge advantage on our cost per acre, and not relying on all these synthetic fertilizers.
Yeah, that's an important thing to point out. A
little bit of a
yeah,
tangent.
no, it's an important thing to point out though with when reading a soil sample, because soil science is, less than 100 years old. And when you're talking about chemistry or physics, and, you've got thousands of years of understanding that science, and yet we really are kind of on a new frontier of soil science. So I think it's important to make sure you're getting information from good sources and not just marketing phrases around, soil buzzwords, and really understand, what has been proven as far as base saturations and pH and cation exchange capacity, and focus on those instead of going off, on some of these tangents out there now that it's really, marketing to sell products to the farmers. And I think a lot of times that's something that we have to battle as crop consultants, is weeding through those, some of these marketing phrases, to get back to okay, what do we actually know about soil science, and how can we make the best recommendation from an ROI standpoint, in a fertility program. So I mean, we might just keep going, and we'll have a part 2, because there's a lot of important stuff.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave anything out. I know some people are probably less interested in everything we're talking about, and it's just a mindset of, I've got an agronomist to do that for me. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you have somebody that knows how to read a soil sample that you're working with, or someone involved in the family farm, that can help you make these recommendations. So I think that's probably a pretty good wrap on pH, and how it's a calculation based on your base saturation percentages, and how each of those cations relate to each other in that total 100% of your soil, and how that's soil structure. And then your cation exchange capacity, that ability for your soil to hold on to water and nutrients, and then the organic matter portion of that soil sample, and really understanding how that biology is mineralizing, what times of the year it's mineralizing, and how many pounds we can count on per percent of organic matter. And I think we kind of covered that today. So obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either Sam or myself, or find us on nextgenfertilizers.com. And tune in for part 2, when we get into nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium.